Much like last week, this week is all about the stuff that divides us. But this time, we talk all about God, Yahweh, Allah, and all the other names of the Sky Daddy or Daddies that control our lives. We're getting into some probably heavy blasphemy this week as we delve into the world of religion and how so many philosophies about we should be good to each other has devolved into butchering heathens in the name of a God who may or may not give a shit. This and more on Why Aren't You Talking About This? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Why Aren't You Talking About This? I'm your host, William. I'll be your guide through the world tour of religion today. And if you expect an intro joke there about how unqualified I am, then you haven't been listening close enough for nearly as long enough. The setup is every episode of the show. Anyways, as always, thank you all for listening. It means the world to me. Even if you're listening in church very quietly because you're a cringy teenager that doesn't want to be there. Trust me, sitting down for 2 hours is as good as boring gets. Okay, in this episode, on top of telling you to download, I do have a few announcements. Firstly, I'm opening up submissions for episode 20. Now, every 20 episodes on the show is special, since that's when we're doing a looking back and review episode to do corrections, comments, updates, and everything else like that. So you have corrections, updates, or other messages, just send it there. Also, the next episode to come out will be in a month rather than 2 weeks. I've been slammed with work and trying to balance this, that, and having a life, and also trying to get a fanboy in my ass. And it's been hard to keep the episodes coming. Now, calm down. I'm not quitting the show. I just need to catch up. Don't celebrate just yet. But anyways, let's just get on to the show. Alright, so this episode, we're starting off just talking basic stuff about religion and faith in general. And like other episodes, we're beginning with defining religion. Put simply, it's a system of faith and worship, especially when done by a large group of people dedicated to inhuman powers or humans who have ascended to a different level of existence, such as the case for ancestor worship. Now, another important definition is the definition of a cult being a religious sect put together by a single, highly charismatic leader that excessively controls its members and performs some form of deviant or sinister practice. And the reason why it's important to put them together is to both distinguish them and draw similarities. Because a lot of people will say that all religion is a cult, but this simply isn't true. While a religion could start as a cult, something like the Catholic Church isn't a cult. Because sure, they have all those, uh, you know, yeah. And, their buildings are gaudy, and Catholicism is one of the more strict mainstream forms of Christianity, but they aren't a cult because they aren't strict enough. Now, it's also why the Amish get away with it, despite their issues, because there isn't a single charismatic leader, as instead a tightly woven network of shame that keeps them practicing. Meanwhile, something like Scientology is for sure a cult because it's a pay-to-win religion created by a sci-fi writer in the 1950s that routinely does horrific shit and then uses an army of lawyers to cover it up and requires their members to be nearly fanatical cash cows. Now, the common thread is faith, and oftentimes faith that is proven through a series of devoted actions and the common bond of a shared cause. But now that I've said the obvious, offended Scientologists and the Amish, not that they could really say anything about it, and implied that the Catholic Church is absolutely a religion, despite really looking like the surprise but absolutely not a surprise villain of every fantasy series ever, what's even the point in the first place, and why do we have this thing? Well, to answer the second half and address the first, Because religion gives us purpose and a reason to live. I mean, think humans are highly curious, self aware anxiety monkeys living in a world that's very often harsh in a constant fuck around and find out mood. It's a lot easier to deal with all of that and also the other anxiety apes having a subconscious panic attack if you can explain what you don't understand and also the random hand of fate with, oh, well, someone knows why that happened and they made it happen because Tim got too curious with an ear of corn. By having gods and religion, we can explain things and temporarily calm down the eternal existential crisis within all of us until the next bad thing happens to us, and we remember that God is a cruel daddy and left us unfinished because it's more fun to watch. Now, it also helps to cope with things that otherwise stop us from doing literally anything, like the crushing existential fear of death with a promise of an afterlife. Now, the second purpose of religion is to allow us another reason and way to come together as a unified collective around a similar set of beliefs and purpose. Now, this makes our societies more unified and stable, which for creatures that are as social as us, where not socializing causes literal brain damage that doesn't heal, it's very important. And because this is something where people can agree on core ideals of, like our purpose and reality and who controls this fucking shit show, allows us to actually agree with each other enough to help each other out and not just go all lone wolf and then fucking die, because human needs are more than you can do in a single day. And having common practices can strengthen these bonds. Like, sure, you fucking hate Gerald with every fiber of your being and would gladly fling him into hell with you if you were guaranteed he'd stay down there with you. But he does go to church, so I guess he's an okay guy. Now, third, religion is also an agent of social order and societal control. And no, I don't mean this in the religion is cringe and I'm smart because I'm an atheist kind of ways. I mean that the social contract is a lot stronger when it's more than just a human reinforcing it. For example, sure, it's pretty fucking effective when it's like, hey, Ugg over there will bash your face inside out with a rock if you start hoarding food. But your brain might wander and go, oh, but what if I bash Ugg? Or what if Ugg dies? And you're more likely to steal because, after all, it's just one dude. But what religion says is, hey, don't steal food because this incredibly powerful creature that makes fruit grow and animals taste good fucking hates thieves and they see everything. And if you do it, when you die, they'll fucking eat you alive every single day. And that's pretty effective because, reasonably, none of that sounds worth it to piss off the thing that gives you food. And also, obviously, if you're a believer in the faith, you'll put value in things the faith does, meaning you're also engaging with the social order. Obviously, this canon has been used by governments as a system of control on top of that. Okay, and fourth is the idea that religion gives us a greater sense of belonging and well being, and this gives us both emotional and physical benefits. Now, like the first one, because God is cruel, the universe is a series of lies we're taught until we inevitably die, we've been created with both a need for emotional well being and stability and a brain that seems hell bent on not doing that at every opportunity. So when we go through some rough shit, having faith in something greater than ourselves, and that something is looking out for us, or that there's something to fight against, can provide comfort and direction. And having something consistent, even something evil, to latch onto during chaos can be exceptionally mind clearing. And in addition, religion can provide an outlet for shared social values with others, basically guaranteeing some kind of positive interaction. Like, I, for example, am very witchy and get excited to meet other witchy people because we have those shared values. Now, in the physical part of this, a lot of religions have some kind of focus on caring for this meat palace of our own hubris we call a body, or at the very least not actively destroying it. In addition, when we feel good, our bodies heal better and easier from stress and stress damage, and we have a lessened physical impact from that stress. Now, finally, religion can be an excellent motivator. Now, if you see something negative as just the nature of the world, you might be less inclined to fix it because that's just how things are supposed to be, or alternatively, you're powerless to stop it. And even when you go about the process of fixing it, it is usually to fix tactile material conditions and can often take a more detached process where you're looking for the root cause to stem the flow. Which obviously has a place, but if people are starving, you should also be feeding them instead of just going after the root issue. But with religion in the picture, you aren't just feeding the hungry because it's pretty fucked up to starve to death. You're doing it because it's wrong to let people starve according to the motherfucker that's running the show, and you've got me fucked up if you don't do anything about it. You aren't just a good person doing good things anymore, you're a crusader. Now, you aren't going to get discouraged as long as you have faith and also are focused on addressing the issue to its fullest extent, even beyond reason. You're fighting on the side of good against evil. And that is extremely powerful when you need to get people together and fight against something. Like, for example, it's hard to motivate people on the left side of the political compass to work together for a singular goal against, say, like, the rise of fascism, because by and large we look at the problem intellectually, i.e., genocide is bad because, instead of just saying, fascists are evil and it's our moral obligation to Sky Daddy to not let this shit happen again. Okay, but I can feel the atheist frothing at the mouth and dripping rage-induced pre-cum, so we're going to talk about the drawbacks of religion as well. Now, first, and probably freshest in everyone's brain, religion can halt positive progress, change, and well-placed and deserved negative emotions and discontent. By saying, God doesn't like it when you put things in your ass, not only do you deny the straights a form of pleasure they'd never imagined, but you also not so slyly say that people that do that anyways, or where that's their main form of penetrative sex, like queer men and bees with Venuses and straight mommies with girl cocks, are all morally wrong and implies they shouldn't exist, or at the very least aren't valid. Which is bad. Now, the other half being the emotions, is that faith can make people complacent or even feel guilty for valid emotions. Wanting more money because they can barely afford to keep the lights on? Well, that's greedy. Enraged about the unfairness of their living conditions and vengefully enraged that they're being abused? Well, that's awfully wrathful, isn't it? And this can breed inaction and acceptance as people hope to live well enough to get to the good afterlife instead of acting out on Earth to improve not only their conditions, but everyone's conditions. And related to that, religion, as it exists now, is very traditionalist and conservative, meaning that it supports traditional views of how the world works, which, like mentioned above, often includes things our ancestors didn't like because they were fucking stupid assholes, like, gay sex, women, and that sticky icky. But also because of these traditional views, things that improve people's lives or empower them, like access to healthcare, social programs, and again, well deserved rage, are interpreted as an attack on the faith and also trying to dismantle God. And this also includes basically everything that fucks up the entire world and holds back progress that we trace back to someone being a silly, stubborn bitch about what Jeezy Boy would like. Now, third, religion can actively support and exacerbate conflicts. From causing them because of vague and mild religious differences to being two-faced that literally don't allow themselves to coexist. And if you depict your enemy as a soy jack, sorry, I meant evil, then you can redefine the conflict. No, you aren't invading their land and massacring people because you're a sore loser and their prime minister got a sick burn off on you. It's because their people are literally the scions of evil, and if you don't kill them all, the world will end. Like in the last episode, because you can't compare religions one to one, it means that the only way to prove your faith is more correct is the Cain and the Abels that disagree with you. And finally, is that you can use the shield of religion to hide some really fucked up shit. From the sexual assault and pedophilia claims against the Catholic Church, sure you Catholics are happy about me saying that again, to Israel's close to, if not actual genocide of the Palestinians and all the war crimes they do, and even to more extreme things. Somehow. But ultimately, by using faith, you can absolve yourself of responsibility or wash your hands of people of the same faith committing terrible acts as the will of Sky Daddy. Or smush the bell curve of morality back to a flat line to make the awful shit you and your followers do acceptable for the greater good. But now that I've sucked religion off and also bit its dick, let's actually talk about some of the core beliefs of some of the most well known and important religions in the world. And because statistically you're an American and also a Christian, we'll start with Christianity. Christianity is a monotheistic Abrahamic religion that follows the Messiah and prophet, Jesus Christ, as divinity and follows his teachings. Now, monotheistic means one God, and Abrahamic derives from the prophet Abraham. But the core values of Christianity are love, forgiveness, repentance, and leaving judgment to God. And this isn't just like a love for your neighbors and Big Jeezy who died for your sins. No, love the people that hate you and that are your enemies. And also, not only are all people capable of repenting, but also should be forgiven, and you should also do both. And this lack of judgment means don't be a hypocrite too, which, given that these are the core values, I think most Christians I have met break this value. And also, while these core values are very nice, for my own spirituality, I strongly disagree. Some people are just scumbags that deserve to suffer and don't deserve love nor forgiveness. But anyways, let's talk about another monotheistic Abrahamic religion, Islam. Islam is the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and it's focused around submission to and commitment to God and also peacefulness. And now, before any of you out there go, huh, hypocrites, remember that Jeezy Boy tells you not to be an asshole, and also, fuck off. Now, interestingly, Islam recognizes all past prophets as true prophets, but Jesus, in their mind, isn't divine, similar to Judaism. And Islam is generally not only tolerant towards science and invention, but in the Islamic Golden Age, openly encouraged it. Now, the tenets of Islam are Shahadat, declaration of faith, Salat, ritual prayer, Zakah, alms, Psalm, fasting, and Haji, pilgrimage. So for Shahadah, you're required to declare that God, called Allah in Islam, is the only true God and the final prophet is Muhammad. Salat is a ritual of all Muslims praying together at dawn, noon, mid-afternoon, sunset, and night towards Mecca. Zakah is giving at least 2.5% of your total wealth to those in need and in poverty, and importantly, without making a whole deal about it, because it's not charity when it's filmed. Okay, and Psalm is the fast during the daylight hours of Ramadan to remind people of the goodness that comes to those who wait, and also shows camaraderie with the poor. And Ramadan is also a time for intense study and self-discipline. And finally, Haji is a ritual to travel to the Kaaba in Mecca at least once in your life. And because it builds on both Judaism and Christianity, my issue with Islam is the same as it is for Christianity, but the things that I have a lot of respect for is you can't just say, oh yeah, I'm Muslim, and no one can roll their eyes while you ignore Ramadan and don't follow Salat. Which is a huge problem I have with Christianity. With Christianity, you give a shout out to Jesus Horsecock Christ chilling in heaven before you kick a field goal and you're a good Christian boy. Now, I respect it when a faith makes you actually full send a commitment to be part of the team. Speaking of which, let's round out this Abraham's triangle with the papa of them all, Judaism. Judaism, like the other faiths, is a monotheistic Abrahamic religion, but is focused on the following of divine laws and the bloodlines of the 12 tribes of Jacob, grandson of Abraham. See, Judaism emphasizes a strict adherence to a covenant made with Yahweh, or God, to follow his strict rules of living as a symbol of devotion, honor, and praise to him. Now, part of this is that it's supposed to be difficult and something you do by choice. But that being said, this faith also heavily emphasizes community unity, responsibility, and obedience. And what are these rules? I keep saying rules and living by them and them being difficult, but I mean, what exactly are they? Well, there are 613. So strap in. The first is, and no, I'm not doing that. But these rules, called the mitzvot, are 613 commandments straight from God on how to act to obey his covenant. And because there are so many, another important aspect of Judaism is studying both the mitzvot and also the Holy Tanakh, the Jewish holy book, but in particular the Torah, the book of laws, which for the Christians is the Old Testament. Also, the Old Testament, to you Christians, is the part you're not supposed to follow anymore. Keep that in mind. But let's look at other religions, beginning first with Hinduism. Hinduism is a collection of traditions and philosophies native to India, all being a complex and super fucking old interlaced system of beliefs, ideas, rituals, gods, theology, and all other good religious stuff focused around the four goods of human life. The first, kama, is the pursuit of pleasure. The second, artha, is the pursuit of material success. Dharma is leading a good and just life. And moksha is reaching enlightenment. And if you complete all four within your life, you become freed with suffering and reunite your soul with the universal and supreme spirit, Brahman, from which every other thing is derived. Also, Hinduism is very complicated and also very old and filled with symbols, exceptions, nuance, and more variations than I will ever be able to give anything along the lines of justice to. So if you're curious or a practitioner that wants to tell me to go fuck myself, I get it. And also, if you're curious, you have the entire internet, and if you're a practitioner, you can tell me to eat shit via email. And next we have Buddhism. Buddhism is a series of teachings and morals with the goal of enlightenment and the perfected state of nirvana to escape the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth taught by Buddha. Now, rebirth is really key to the ideas of Buddhism, as Buddhists believe that there are 6 realms, or forms, of reality you can be reborn into depending on your karmic standing in the universe. The good ones, in descending order, are the realm of the gods, realm of the demigods, and the realm of humanity. And the bad ones are the realm of animals, realm of ghosts, and the realm of hell. But as far as actual philosophies go, there are the 4 noble truths and the 5 moral precepts. The noble truths are suffering, the cause of suffering, the path to suffering's end, and the end of suffering. Which the point is that suffering and pain and discomfort happen in life, but that it always ends, and there's always a reason and a way to end it. Basically, this too shall pass, but with an actual system of faith and action rather than a single phrase. And the 5 moral precepts are: don't take a life, don't take what isn't given, refrain from sexual misconduct and misuse of the senses, refrain from wrong speech, i.e., being a dick or a racist, and refrain from mind clouding intoxicants. Which, hey, if you have the discipline, are all good things and are also pretty good for you and for society. Yeah, the problem is I just like being a dickhead too much and using drugs to really be all in on it. Okay, but next we have Shintoism. If you're a fucking no good weeb, you probably know something about this one already. Shintoism is an animist, basically everything having a spirit, religion that teaches proper respect, appeasement, thanks, and worship of all things in the form of kami. And Shintoism stresses the importance of purity, harmony, and respect for nature, as well as a respect for the family and your ancestry. Another important factor is subordination to the group and putting the needs of the whole above your own, which, if you know much about Japanese culture, you can see how the two have influenced each other. But this is also one that is very similar to a lot of my spiritual beliefs. Well, except for the respect for family and ancestry, I think the relationships you choose to have are more important, but still, I get it, and it's pretty cool if you're into respecting your grandma like a fucking weirdo. Next is Taoism or Taoism. This is both a religion and a lifestyle that is focused on falling into alignment and thus becoming one with the source of all things, the Tao. And commonly, the methods used are concepts used for self growth and self cultivation, like meditation, spiritual rituals, going to fucking therapy, and also internalized alchemy, which is the ingestion of things to alter your spiritual properties in line with the Tao. And while each school of thought emphasizes different virtues, all of them heavily focus on the 3 treasures, being compassion, frugality, and humility. And What ultimately is the goal, you're asking? Well, it's for longevity, becoming a wise sage, or, in some schools of thought, even becoming an immortal being that has reached enlightenment and perfect alignment with the Tao. And next we have voodoo, which is a relative newcomer in the religion game and is a semi monotheistic religion, I should say, Abrahamic religion, that combines Catholicism and traditional African religions. Primarily is that everything is a spirit, not has a spirit, but is a spirit that simply exists on different planes of existence. And this encompasses not only religion and philosophy, but includes its own system of medicine, justice, education, and social order. And a lot of the practices are very individualized and dependent on your teachers, as it is almost entirely an oral tradition without much, if any, written beliefs, as it's part of the faith to maintain its oral component. Like sex, you can't remove the oral component without removing what makes it worthwhile in the first place. But most of the practices, rituals, and rites are about offering prayers and other offerings to both God and spirits on the other planes for health, favor, and luck, just to name a few. Okay, and finally, before we go to the history, we have Sikhism, another relative newcomer. This monotheistic religion is focused on equality, social justice, service to humanity, and tolerance of other faiths. Under Sikhism, all people are equal regardless of their caste, ethnicity, gender, sex, nationality, or religion, and they believe in the universal acceptance of all humanity under the one God, called Truth, or Satnam. Now, you've probably seen something depicting a Sikh, or have actually seen a Sikh person in real life. Now, baptized Sikhs are required to never cut any hair on their body from birth to death. In addition, or from when they convert to death. In addition, they're required to carry an iron bangle, called a kara, on their wrists, kacha underwear, which are like long underwear, not like the Mormon magic underwear, but long underwear. Carry a conga comb, and wear a kirpan, a small sword or dagger, on their hip. Their lifestyle is based on the ideas of working and earning by your own work, living a familial lifestyle, practicing honesty and truthfulness in all dealings, to share, live as an inspiration and support for your community, and control the following emotions: calm, desire, krodh, or anger, lobh, greed, moh, attachment, and hankar, pride. And with that covered, let's go over to the history section. Okay, and like last episode, we're starting with some vague archaeological Stone Age bullshit. Because for a very long time, our best guess as to the origin of religion has to do with burial. And why is that? Well, because for a very long time, humans didn't have writing, and any of the materials available to carve into or mold in any way that would last could easily be mistaken as something else, be reused or destroyed, or just simply rot away. But something that humans do that isn't something that naturally occurs is burials. There's no logical, stem brained reason to do a burial besides some sort of emotional or spiritual purpose. But of course, this is controversial as a sign of religion because 4 fucking feet of dirt also keeps the rotting corpse smell and diseases away. But regardless, 100,000 BC is the first signs of humans burying each other. And between 70,000 and 35,000 BC is when we have signs of Neanderthals being buried by both Homo sapiens and other Neanderthals across Europe and the Middle East. And we also have evidence of intentional cremation of a corpse in 40k BC. Now, whether this was due to some ritual, a funerary rite, or a very, very large man wearing green deciding a pointy-eared child needed to be incinerated, we aren't sure. Go listen to Nerd if you know that reference, you fucking nerd. And now, all of this seems pretty mild, even by white people standards, but we're about to get a lot spicier. Beginning in 38,000 BC, when a statue was created somewhere in Germany depicting a man with a lion head. And now, well, with how the history has gone, you might assume that this is some pre-civilization starving artist getting a bit too creative with the shrooms, Most archaeologists actually believe this represents a deity of some kind. And about 3,000 years later, in 35,000 BC, all the way to about 26,000 BC, we begin to see both statuettes and full blown massive carvings of something now called the Venus figures. Now, these figurines are the ones that Hellboy used to crush Tooth Fairy in the first movie. No joke, this is the first time I've ever seen them and didn't recognize it until I researched this episode. But they started turning up at grave and burial sites. But weirdly, also with like weapons stabbed into them or mutilated. So archaeologists believe that it's some kind of ritual to sacrifice these statuettes to the dead, or maybe it was like a form of curse. Regardless, during this time is also when we see people carving and also putting dyes on the bones of the dead. And we continue to see this, but also carvings, pendants, beads, instruments, and other things labeled as being for ritual use buried with bodies up until 21,000 BC. And somewhere in the 5,000 year time span between 13,000 BC and 8,000 BC, a time frame just about the size of civilization itself, we begin to see the mass storage of bodies in places like caves or tomb complexes, and bones occasionally being removed from these areas and put in a long term storage. Again, something most people believe to represent some sort of religion. But after this is when we see more concrete signs that you concretophiles can get your rocks off to. Between 9130 and 7370 BC, real fucking specific there, the oldest worship centers in the world were constructed and used. Göbekli Tepe and the Vali Kori, both in Turkey. But we don't know a ton about these places. We're pretty sure that they were primarily, if not entirely, worship centers. And the same can be said of the settlement Ketahaluk, also in Turkey, used somewhere between the 7500 BC and 5700 BC. And we 100% know about this one because there are statues, shrines, and clay figurines of phallic, yonic, masculine, feminine, human, and animal scenes, symbols, and art pieces all over the fucking place. And this isn't like the defacing of school or public property we all did as younglings. No, these are dedicated shrines. To who or what? No fucking clue. But they worship something. And this was followed by the Ain Ghazal statues in Jordan constructed between 7250 and 6500 BC that are all pretty sure that we are pretty sure represent gods. I'm gonna fucking warn you, don't look at these if you're planning on going to sleep anytime soon. Holy fuck, are they terrifying. And I gotta say, looking at them, I fucking hope that those were gods and just not how people looked back then. Would make it real hard to jerk off the cave woman hentai. But meanwhile, on the Crayon Muncher Island, both in the New Grange Tomb and Stonehenge began to be built around 3100 BC. Now, New Grange Tomb is a massive complex that is built to have its doorway aligned with the winter solstice sun, meaning it was 100% for sure some kind of religious monument, because there's no other reason to do that. And Stonehenge is incredibly spiritually important, and in this original form was believed to be a burial ground as well. But this far back in the timeline, it's mostly made of wood. So, yeah, real fucking disappointing there. And now shit starts going crazy because as writing develops around 3000 BC, the Sumerians give us some of the first religious records ever written, which I have no other information on. Literally no fucking idea what's real these days, but we do know that they existed. Fucking weird alien conspiracy theorists online. Anyways, by the year 2610 BC, the first Egyptian pyramid was built for the pharaoh Djoser. Djoser. And besides my pronunciation, this is also a good time as any to stop real quick and disappoint you. The research on this was already pretty fucking dense. So not every religion is going to get covered. In fact, most of them won't. And a big example is ancient religions. And a lot of this has to do with canon, like it's a fucking comic book. But I do want to tell you how most of these religions kind of worked. See, Given that people can't really move around too much back in the day, most developed gods very personal to their own region. And as societies became more advanced and spread, cultures began to swap gods, like a Gyaru swapping gum during an orgy in those hentais I totally don't read. And sometimes that creates widespread deities like Ra in Egypt and Zeus in Greece, where a bunch of different ideas slowly get mushed together, and the religious leaders of that culture view these gods as cross-regionally important. But this means that gods like Pan, Dionysus, Apollo, and Hermes all getting swapped around in various tellings of Greek mythology. And these slight differences don't matter until you're trying to run a motherfucking ancient Greek D&D game in the modern day with realistic mythology where the gods are real and every third story says Pan and Hermes are the same dude and every seventh says that Pan and Dionysus are and that actually Apollo and Hermes are the same dude. No, I'm not salty at all. And that's why I'm not covering these religions. Were they real religions? Yes. Did they have a single canon? No, and you'd be lucky to narrow it down to less than 10. But, anyways, by 2600 BC, Stonehenge was finally finished, being in its somewhat current form and entirely made out of stone. Lazy bastards took them thousands of years. And 40 years later, overcome with a sensation of being outdone out of nowhere, the ancient Egyptians built the Great Pyramids of Giza, and they have yet to be outdone. Well, until 1991, when on November 9th, the Memphis Pyramid was built, and then later turned into the largest Bass Pro Shop in the world as a monument to our capitalist greed and complete lack of self-awareness. Now, not within the Great Pyramid or the Bass Pro Shop is some of the oldest true religious pieces of writing we have. You might be thinking that that's the Sumerians, but no, those are reports, not about how to practice a religion. These are the pyramid texts, believed to have been written somewhere between 2494 and 2345 BC on the walls of the pyramids of Saqqara, which were instructions the pharaoh buried within on how to pass to the afterlife and how to walk and shit when you're dead. Which hopefully started right outside the sarcophagus and not down 2 flights of stairs across to the food court and right next to the MAGA hat display. And adding on to this history of writing, the Epic of Gilgamesh is written somewhere between 2150 and 2000 BC, following the king Gilgamesh as he looks for the secret of immortality after seeing his friend die in his arms. It's actually very sadly written. Around this time, too, is when Hinduism and Judaism are believed to have begun in a way we would recognize as a distinct religion. Fucking wild, right? These two religions are still super prominent today, started around the same time that the first piece of literature was ever created. But the actual first piece of Hindu scriptures that we have access to weren't written until 1700 BC and continued to be written into 1100 BC, with India entering its Vedic period, when Hinduism was growing massively and civilization in India was exploding in growth in the middle of this in the 1500s BC. And jumping all the way to the 800s BC and to the 300s is when the Vedic texts are written out, including in them concepts that would go on to inspire a ton of religions in India and the eastern half of the world, including and I apologize for my pronunciation, this episode's going to be full of it, the Chandogya Upanishad between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, which not only contains the first mentions of the incredibly important Hindu figure of Krishna, as well as being one of the oldest surviving Vedic texts that we have. And the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the Jewish holy book, the Tanakh, is probably actually compiled for the first time, this just being 5 books. Now, this would later be referred to as the Book of Laws or the Torah. This is also in Zoroastrianism, a very, very old monotheistic religion built on the teachings of Zoroaster, focused on the conflict between good and evil evil's ultimate defeat at the end of the world, proliferate across the Middle East and into Asia. Now, some scholars think that this is when the religion actually got started, while others cite it between 1400 and 1200 BC. But in either case, this is a very important time for them. Meanwhile, in the Far East, Shu Qing is written. This writing became the basis of Chinese political philosophy until, the 15th fucking century, and would be eventually incorporated into parts of Confucianism. So, very busy 100 years for the gods. And the believed lifespan of Gautama Buddha occurred somewhere within this period as well, either being 563 to 480 BC or 483 to 400 BC. In 551 BC, Confucius is born, and a year later, Taoist philosophy also forms. And just in case you thought the Middle East was calm during this time, you'd be wrong, as the Second Temple period was occurring for the Jewish, beginning in 515 BC, in which the Jews were fighting both civil unrest as well as conquest by and of other groups of the time, including conquest by Alexander the Great, the Babylonians, and eventually the Romans, ending the period in 70 AD. And also in 500 BC, Buddhism and Confucianism are both founded around roughly the same time, both based on the lives and philosophies of their respective founders. And both spread like wildfire, or my ass cheeks would cutie with a cock is nearby. Confucianism spread through China and Chinese influenced cultures, as its merger of political, spiritual, and moral philosophy made massive impacts, and Buddhism spread just as quickly because it's a pretty fucking chill religion. Well, except for that sect in Southeast Asia right now that are becoming armed extremists, but most people very reasonably don't understand why that's happening. But anyways, Buddhism spread to such an extent that it spread to Sri Lanka from northeast India, essentially spreading across the entire continent by 300 BC, and by 250 BC, Buddhism spread as far as ancient Greece because of the Third Buddhist Council, which called for missionaries to go as far across the world as possible. And in 100 BC, and continuing to 500 AD, the practice of yoga, common with Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, is codified formally in 176 sutras of Patanjali, making the practice a lot easier and a lot more widespread. But back in the West, in about 140 BC and continuing until 200 AD, is the creation of the official Hebrew canon, which essentially cemented Judaism into almost its current form. But not all would remain good for the Jewish, as the prophet of a new religion was supposedly born in 7 BC that found a religion with his teachings that would eventually turn into institutions like the Catholic Church and the medieval propaganda machine that would eventually lead to the Shoah. That's right. Jesus Horsecock, wow, we fucked up everything you ever said Christ was born and was killed by the Romans occupying Israel by 33 AD. And yes, I'm skipping over a lot, this isn't Bible study. But his teachings, assuming he even existed, which is controversial and contentious, lived on with his follower Paul, who, using the roads the Romans were so fond of, essentially walked every imaginable path around Rome and spread the word of JHWWFUEYESC up to 1,000 motherfucking miles. And not only Paul, but other Jewish converts did the same, saying that anyone could be a follower of Christ, i.e., a Christian. And this spread so fucking fast that by 50 AD, a full 17 years after Jesus' respawn timer ended, the Christians were already having a council in Jerusalem. In fact, they had a number of councils, including killing Jesus' brother James in 62 AD, which, wow, seems like a short-sighted move. Fortunately, kinda, they didn't have time to realize how bad of an idea it is to kill the brother of the Son of the Almighty, because Rome fucked the ever-loving shit out of Jerusalem in 70 AD. I mean, not entirely. The siege was a long, brutal, and extremely costly siege for both sides. Like my dick. But unlike my dick, this siege and subsequent persecution by the Romans created Rabbinic Judaism, which is the mainstream form of Judaism to this day. But finally, in 100 AD, the Christians had enough numbers to declare themselves a religion, and did so. And then everything was fine, and Christianity continued to be a nice religion that followed GZ Boy to the letter. Except that isn't what happened. Instead, initially the religion was underground, given that the Romans were pretty high and mighty about their totally not Greek with stolen Celtic gods pantheon, and so thought of religions like Judaism and Christianity that called having more than one god cringe as the enemy. So they tried to do a genocide. But despite this, Christianity spread across their empire and eventually into Rome itself, and getting an emperor's booty filled with the holy love of Christ. And yes, I did just condense a lot of history there, but shut the fuck up and be thankful that I'm perpetually doing these scripts just under the wire so we don't have an 8-part episode on this. But in 313, the Romans see the writing on the wall and declare religious tolerance in Rome, meaning you can be openly Christian. And just in time for the 325 Council of Nicaea, a meeting between the Roman, Alexandrian, Antiochite? I'm not sure how you condense Antioch, Anatolian, Jerusalemite, and other Christian groups. And this council was both a declaration of unity between these distant groups and also a chance to agree on their translations and interpretations of Christ and determining the dates of rituals and kinds of practices. And this would be the last time Christians agreed on anything short of where their asshole is and what shouldn't be in there. And by 380, Christianity is declared the official religion of the Roman Empire. Yay, no more genocide for 365 days. Because in 381, paganism is outlawed on pain of death until 391. And in 405, the first Latin Bible was printed, which was convenient considering Rome was crumbling, and clearly the biggest priority is translating the words of God into what would soon be a dead language. And by 424, the Christians had been fighting each other while the entire Roman Empire burned around them for so long that the Eastern Church, being the portions of Near Asia and the Middle East, take their ball and go home, declaring themselves independent from the Antioch Christians and renaming themselves the Oriental Orthodox Church, which then causes a series of councils and near civil wars between groups of Christians between 431 and 451, as all of them realize, oh fuck, you can just do that? And like a group chat dissolving into anarchy as everyone realizes that they actually hate their high school friends, each other assholes, and call councils to say, yo, you got your Bible wrong. My version here says in this passage that you're a cunt. Which, luckily for God's migraine, ends when Rome gobbles and slobs on its own knob to death, and the Christians are temporarily scattered as Europe becomes a shit show. But this doesn't last long, as the Christians in Rome are able to reorganize into something we might recognize as what would become the medieval Catholic Church by the end of the next century. Also, in 570 to 632 is the life of the Islamic prophet Muhammad and the writings of the Quran. And from 632 to 750, Islam spreads across the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and into some parts of modern France, and even eastward a little into the area of the world us Americans forget about that's between India and the Middle East. Also during this time, the Quran is actually compiled into a full-ass book, and also the Sunni and Shia Muslims divide. And if you want to know the difference, it's on who should have succeeded Muhammad after his death to lead the religion as the prophet. The Sunni believe it should have been his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, seeing as this dude wasn't just one of his closest advisors and companions, but also because Muhammad married his daughter. The Shia, however, believe that Ali should have become his successor, since Ali took over many of his political realms, and also was his son-in-law and his banner bearer, which if you understand being an army's banner bearer, you should know how big of a deal that is. And this, combined with getting surprisingly bungled at the Battle of Tours by a bunch of sweaty, dirty Franks supported by Christian faithful, checked the advance of Islam and stalled its progress by 750. Now, also between 716 and 936, the Zoroastrians are ousted from their homes in the Middle East and flee to India due to Islamic persecution against them. Which, goes to show that all Abrahamic religions do this. Anyways, during this time, and by the end of 1050, the entire Nordic part of the world is Christianized through a combination of violence, blood, and missionary work, and all Norse religion is erased, and the ancient art of rune crafting and interpreting is intentionally destroyed. Now, on top of this is also when Christians lose the plot and really start hating the Jewish. Because in their minds, it's the Jews that got Jesus killed, not the homies in Rome. In 1054, the Great Schism occurs, which divides Christian Catholic and Christian East once again, this time founding Eastern Orthodox officially, as the eastern reaches of the Catholic churches finds their lack of Roman emperors to be cringe. Going to the east for a bit, we also have, and again, I apologize for the pronunciation, because holy fuck, Ramanan, oh boy, Ramanan Uch, one second, Ramanjuncharya's life from 1017 to 1137, officially making him, quote, older than balls, at about 120 years old. If you aren't familiar, this is the founder of the vicious Tadavitya uh, Vedanta Hindu philosophy. I am very sorry. And the translation of how important that is will literally take 2 fucking hours. But you know how the Flanderized version of Hinduism is, really big on unity and everyone being part of a single being? Well, this is that, but real. Now, another older than balls philosopher, Milarepa, lived from 1052 to 1135, being a major and incredibly famous yogi. If you don't know who they are, ask your yuppie friend that does yoga, they'll be glad to tell you, that plays a major role in Tibetan Buddhism. And in 1206, the Delhi Sultanate is established in India, which was an Islamic empire. Now, these three things to us in the West might not sound like a big deal, but this is like me name dropping Constantine, Thomas Aquinas, and the Holy Roman Empire. So, while I don't know a whole lot about these things, and, kind of unfortunately too, shout out to all you non Western listeners. Love you, you beautiful fucks. Anyways, so in the West from 1095 to 1272, we were doing a Crusades. Check out last episode for more info. Also, during these, there's a little pagan revival, which is ironic, I know. In 1200 is the first collection of the Mabinogion text, and in 1220 is the Prose Edda. Did these sound like name dropping Eastern philosophers on your Anglo Saxon ass? Well, the Mabinogion, the Mabinogion texts are a collection of Celtic mythology, and the Prose Edda is a collection of Norse mythology. Now, keep in mind, both these regions have been Christianized for a long time, and they've also largely been erased, meaning that while these are the best sources, we have no fucking clue how accurate they are to the actual myths, and we also don't know what things they left out. And getting back to the Crusader mentality, and also the church being a fucker, in 1320, Pope John XXI lays the groundwork for witch hunts by determining the punishment for witchcraft. Mostly death, painfully. And 58 years later, the Western Schism occurs where the Catholic Church can tell its asshole from his elbow and accidentally puts too many elbows in the positions of power where they were meant to put assholes. That is to say, they had more than one pope. Meaning, until 1417, the Catholic Church was ripping itself apart trying to decide which pope was the worst asshole to be in charge, eventually deciding on Pope Martin V. And with that, remove his name from your brain because nobody's going to talk about him ever again. And 1484, witch hunts officially begin with the support from the Catholic Church by proclamation of Pope Innocent VIII, which spreads to Spain by 1500, and they do a motherfucking inquisition. Now, important to note is that these events don't just target vague witches and pagans. It targets heretics, meaning Christians you don't like, Muslims, and Jews, meaning you're doing a prejudice where you know the answer you want beforehand, and you find that answer by killing the person. But once again, back in the East, we have the foundations of Sikhism in 1469 to 1539, as Guru Nanak spreads his teachings across India. And around the same time, between 1486 and 1534, Chaitanya, oh, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu lives in India as a Hindu revivalist and believed avatar Krishna who revolutionizes Hinduism. How, you ask? Well, first of all, by pronouncing his name right. Secondly, he's the one that created the Hare Krishna chant and also created the 8 devotional prayers. Alright, and let's check on how Europe is doing. Ah, well, the Catholic Church are doing dickhead things again. Like charging people for forgiveness for their sins as a way to get away with sinning, and also repressing the poor and supporting tyrants. So, I guess business as usual. But this time, in 1517, Martin Luther, the first one and not the American one, leaves a harshly worded Yelp review on the front door of the church door called the 95 Theses, being 95 ways the Catholic Church are being assholes and are leading people wrong. And this causes the emergence of the much more rules-oriented Lutherans and the fucking rebellious Protestants. Making this worse for the Catholics, Henry VIII creates the Church of England so he can divorce his wives instead of killing them because they didn't shoot boys out of their pussies fast enough. He still wanted to kill them, but he had an alternative at least. And in 1526, the African slave trade adds to the schisming. Now, is it because people realize the open support of slavery from the Catholic Church actively defies the Word of God and that owning people is wrong, and also that perhaps we shouldn't be buying people and sending them thousands of miles away from home to be part of generations of chattel slavery? No. No, it's because African spiritual beliefs begin to be introduced to the West, and some people are like, oh, wow, this is actually pretty cool compared to stanky old Catholicism. And in 1674, things get bad for another Abrahamic religion. The Maratha Empire emerges in India, a Hindu empire that comes as the previous Islamic one collapses. Now, also in 1708, Guru Gobind Singh is the final guru of the Sikh religion, as he declares Guru Granth Sahib, the holy book of Sikhism, the eternal guru, essentially removing this leadership role. Which, as we go back and forth, can we just appreciate how much of a fucking tire fire Europe is basically the entire time during this period? And when we go back to check on the East, most of the major events, besides the normal religious atrocities, are like, yeah, no, this real cool dude lived his life and then made a religion, and even people that don't agree with us think he's pretty chill. While here in the West, Martin Luther is getting excommunicated for having reasonable complaints about a man wearing gold leaf telling poor people that he needs more money. Oh, speaking of which, atheism exists in Europe now. In 1770, Baron de Holbach publishes the very first European piece of writing on atheism in the West with a positive spin, being the system of nature. And during its revolution, France de-Christianizes. And now this removes the church from their political systems and places them under, not over, the Republic of France's department that deals specifically with religion. Which is then overturned, kinda, in 1801 because the Pope and the French decided they like suppressing poor people together, like abusive parents reigniting their love by beating their children, and so the Catholics get some power back in France. And over the next century, specifically 1819 to 1908, a ton of new religious sects and religions are founded, like Babism, Baha'i, Mormonism, Adventism, and the Ahmadiyya movement. Now, while we talk about Mormonism and Adventism when we talk about the US, we're going to mention the other three. Babism was founded in 1844 by Bab, an Iranian merchant turned prophet who taught his followers that rather than God being a knowable figure that communicates directly with humans, he instead is entirely incomprehensible and speaks his will through manifestations. As one might imagine, Babism wasn't particularly popular with the already established Abrahamic religions. And this later turned into the Baha'i faith, which taught that actually all religions are pretty fucking cool and that all faiths are really on the same side and that all people are unified. And again, this got the Abrahamic religions all fucking riled up and angry, because it always does. Meanwhile, in 1889, the Ahmadiyya community is founded in India, with Mirza Ghulam Ahmed at the head. And they believe that he was appointed to guide the Muslims to their final triumph that would eventually represent the end of the world. Now, unlike the extremist Islamic movements we see now with groups like the Taliban and ISIS, this is still found on the Muslim belief that they'll eventually be triumphant through peaceful means. Now, meanwhile, in Europe in 1899, the Aradia is written. This book describes witchcraft in Europe as the Christian hate boner for all things witchcraft begins to reach the post-nut clarity level. And this seems to represent a brief period of pagan revitalization and secularism, because in 1901 in the UK, the Spiritualists National Union representing the faith of spiritualism is incorporated, by name, and by 1904, Thelema is founded by Aleister Crowley. Which, if you know Aleister Crowley, oh boy. But now this religion is still but now this religion is a still surviving occultist religion focused on inspiring people to do what they will by worship of the Thelemic pantheon, representing symbolic archetypes and metaphors for humanity. And then the next year, France becomes fully secular in its government, and by 1917, with the October Revolution being successful in Russia, Christians in Russia begin to be persecuted, leading to the destruction of most, if not all, Russian churches, but also the killing of between 12 and 20 million Russian Christians in the Soviet Union between 1922 and 1991. Now, notably, this doesn't mean that Christians were martyrs as a whole, as while this was happening, in Mexico, as the country moved further and further away from religion and towards secular government, Christians rebelled and the government clashed with them during the Cristero War between 1926 and 1929. And this doesn't mean that non-Abrahamic movements were doing nothing during this period. In 1907, the Hindu sect BAPS is formed. This form of Hinduism was founded on the idea of Swarm in Aran, one of the biggest gurus in all of Hinduism, was still present on Earth through the actions of other gurus. And now, to this day, this is one of the biggest denominations of Hinduism. And while they're in some hot water today with various governments, especially the U.S. government, a big part of the religion has been for a long time enforcing Hindu beliefs in everyday life, including charity and humanitarian efforts. And in 1932, Hinduism explodes in popularity again as the Brahma Kumaris is founded, a kind of neo-Hinduism. And in 1930, another new religion is founded in Jamaica, called Rastafarianism, which is founded with the crowning of Haile Selassie as the Emperor of Ethiopia. And Rastafarianism is basically a religion built on the idea that the racial injustice, economic injustice, and slavery affecting the African descendant residents of Jamaica is a test by God, or Jah, in their teachings, and that one day they'll be delivered and returned to the homeland of Zion, being Africa in this case. And speaking of the 1930s, something we haven't touched on much, but has been present across Europe for centuries, is massive and growing anti-Semitism. From the Italian massacres and assassinations of the Jews during the Renaissance, to the Soviet propaganda that the Jews controlled everything and were actually running the scenes, which is, yes, where that comes from. But in the 1930s, this is reaching a fever pitch as much of the Christianized Western world is filled with an almost explosive level of anti-Semitism. It was Germany that lit the fuse, as in 1939, after the Nazis gained power and had been building up for a while, the Shoah begins to eliminate the Jewish people from Europe entirely. And because of this, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million Jewish people were killed by Germany and its allies in just a matter of 5 or 6 years. And while, again, this is really flattening out the whole event, the Shoah is a massive topic and is truly an unimaginable reign of terror that I don't have the time or honestly the moral fiber to cover in full. Now, I highly suggest the time suck episodes on the topic, which are two 3+ hour long episodes on it. But in the aftermath, post 1945, a lot of people in the world really had their opinions of religious extremism soured. And a lot of religious groups across the world began to pull back their anti theological beliefs around other religions, largely because of the Shoah, especially around the Jewish. And due to these changing attitudes, in 1947, an Islamic State is founded in Pakistan as a safe haven for Muslims. And in 1948, Israel is founded in the name of Judaism, largely for the same purpose. But now we have the era of religious flourishing, with a ton of new religions being founded. In 1954, Wicca is founded, a religion of European witchcraft practices. And this religion is heavily publicized and spread by Gerald Gardner around Europe. 2 years later, a new form of Buddhism called Navayana Buddhism is also founded. But rather than by Gerald, it's founded by B.R. Ambedkar. Now, this Buddhism is often called Neo-Buddhism, considering itself as a reinvigoration of the ancient Buddhist ideas and altering the foundational concepts of Buddhism to be, quote-unquote, less flawed and pessimistic, especially in the doctrines of the Four Noble Truths and existing outside of the self. And as the world forgot the lessons of the Shoah surprisingly fast, Russia continued its persecution of both the Jews and Christians, while China began to redouble its persecution of its wide swath of very ancient and also not at all scummy religions, including the invasion of Tibet and attempted erasure of Tibetan Buddhism, causing the Dalai Lama to flee in 1959. However, while this is happening, the 1960s introduced even more However, while this is happening, the 1960s introduced even more religions, with a neo-paganism and New Age religious revival, including Unitarianism, Universalism, the Church of All Worlds, and the Church of Satan. It's not as bad as it sounds. And in 1965, Srila Prabhupada, I'm gonna apologize for this whole episode. An Indian guru establishes an organization called the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, allowing Hindu scripture to be mass distributed. And then in 1972, and continuing on to 2004, we also have the German neo pagan revival, where Germanic religions begin to make a comeback across Europe. Then, 17 years later, Christianity reemerges across Europe as Eastern European nations overthrow their Soviet overseers. And now for the final thing that we're going to talk about, in 1979, we see the first dominoes being tipped that eventually leads to ISIS. Now, the Iranian Revolution creates the Iranian Islamic Republic, and with both the US and USSR fucking around in the Middle East, this combo causes the rise of organizations like the Taliban as both nations refuse to mind their own goddamn business and let the post-revolution nation stabilize itself. Something that not only eventually caused 9/11, the establishment of Islamic terrorism and extremist groups across the Middle East, and it also caused the 2011 civil war in Syria that cuts the country into pieces temporarily between the Sunni Muslims, Alawites, and Shiites. And in 2014, ISIS is founded. And again, all of this was because of the biggest, dumbest, angriest assholes in the room being egged on by the Cold War. Okay, but holy fuck, there's a lot of information there. But we are just going to go back and cover the American timeline. So, beginning before colonization, we have all the various religions of the Native Americans. Now, these religions, rather than being a widespread holy word of a single god, are combinations of shared history and cultural stories with a particular twist towards your own specific tribe or clan. So, for example, every group of Cherokee would have a legend about the Uktena horned serpents. Each individual tribe might have a story about a hero from their tribe killed one of them. And then the Spanish, French, Dutch, English, and Portuguese brought religion. Their religion. while the Spanish and Portuguese, using the system of conquistadors and treasure hunting conquerors, brought Catholic priests to ensure that this genocide was brought to you by today's sponsor, Jesus. The French, Dutch, and English used a much less controlled method. Instead, many of these people who came over initially from these groups were religious, but not like bring a priest to the murder religious, or were outcast because they were too fucking religious. And one of the earliest colonies the Americans care about, Virginia, was established in 1619, built on a solid foundation of religious laws, making it an attractive option for people who wanted to be way, way, way too puritanical. Speaking of which, between 1629 and 1640 was the era of the Puritan colonies being established in New England. Now, this group, unlike what most of American history may teach, weren't their own sect, but were instead under the belief that mid 1600s Europe was corrupt and wicked, and society had strayed too far from God's holy light, and only they, with their exceptionally individualistic, holier than thou attitude, endless toiling in the dirt and mud with no rest allowed, and hellfire preaching about how everyone else is going to hell, and the only way to live was an unhappy but holy life. And we wonder why we are how we are. And during this era, in 1632, Maryland was founded as a Catholic haven in the colonies. And why was this necessary? Well, because the Puritans, as followers of the Anglican Church of England, fucking hated them, and the only other place with a big enough population to be attractive to the Catholics, Virginia, required universal Anglicanism. Now, while Anglicanism preferred formal services, seeing as this was the frontier, this was also the beginnings of a lot of American individualism, as the Anglican priests in the colonies were tired of seeing pew upon pew of uninterested faces, and so said, well, fuck it, you can pry on your own and it's just as good. This is followed by the founding of Rhode Island in 1636 after Roger Williams was expelled from Massachusetts. Why, you ask? Well, because he said that God and the government is kind of cringe, and that maybe faith should be a personal matter rather than a government matter. Fucking sicko. And in 1652, the Quakers are founded. And this sect, formally called the Religious Society of Friends, disagreed on the portion of oatmeal given at mealtimes, and so England told them to fuck off to the Americas. Now, rather, the Quakers were kicked out because they think that the formal set of rites, an ordained ministry, and priests being pro-war is fucking dumb. Which, basically any other form of Christianity at the time was essentially straight-up heresy. 2 years after they were founded and began fleeing to the American colonies, Jewish refugees flee to New Amsterdam, which is now New York, and don't you fucking dare ask me why they changed it. I can't say, but my guess is people just liked it better that way, after persecutions in Dutch Brazil. And even though they're welcomed, Quakers aren't. Between 1659 and 1661, capital punishment is implemented for people who are expelled from Boston and other colonies for their religion and come back. Just fucking wild. On top of this, laws are created specifically to fuck over the entirely peaceful and non-violent Quakers because the Puritans were put off by the idea of a group of Christians that didn't want to kill people less fortunate than them. By 1678 as well, the Jewish population of the colonies became significant and they began to buy land in Rhode Island, creating their own haven. Finally, having enough of religious tolerance as a concept, the Puritans make a habit of witch hunts, expulsion of dissenters from their colonies, and a level of religious intolerance that the faithful of today would honestly probably just be completely cool with. And this eventually causes the founding of Pennsylvania by Quakers in 1685, named after William Penn. Unfortunately for them, the Catholics and the Jews, in 1689, the Glorious Revolution occurs in England, which declares the Church of England as the official religion in the colonies. And then things get worse for everyone, Puritan or not, in 1692 when the Salem witch trials began. This series of trials, where innocent people are accused of, 30 found guilty of, and 19 executed for witchcraft, was started by a bunch of bored little shits accusing a woman that lived nearby of being a witch after they were probably seen trying to, I don't fucking know, skin a live cat, and she intervened. Sometimes children are evil. But now we're going to move on to the mid 18th century. As between the late 17th century and now, Germans begin to emigrate to Pennsylvania in mass. When with the religious tolerance of the Quakers and their generally pretty chill influence causes the establishment of groups such as the Mennonites, Amish, Dunkers, Moravians, and Schweckfelders. In addition, likely not by choice, Judeo-Christian participation in the colonies sharply increases to just over 75%. And this fervor serves as the backdrop for the First Great Awakening. This is when evangelicalism becomes a thing, focusing on Christian guilt and the potential for salvation with a focus on preaching to people to teach them the Word of God, i.e., evangelizing. And this made religion highly personal, as it wasn't just priests who evangelized, but all good Christian boys and girls. And this made it especially popular in the South, as there were fewer established churches, while causing massive religious fracturing across the northern colonies. This also spread to various forms of Jesus loving to the enslaved peoples, assumedly leaving out the parts about how slavery is meant to be a temporary thing and that God loves the enslaved more than the slavers. But all of this causes the establishment of the Baptists in the 1760s in the South. Now, baptism was especially popular with both the poor and the enslaved, as it focused heavily on personal accountability to God, being saved by your faith alone, rather than needing a big guy in a funny hat to do on your behalf, and that the only rules are the things written in the Bible. And they're called Baptists because they believe in the importance of followers of Christ being baptized after they show their devotion to God, and not as part of the process of conversion. This is also the first rumblings of a separation of church and state, as in 1773, a prominent Baptist minister, Isaac Backus, says, "Church and state are separate. The effects are happy, and they do not at all interfere with each other. Where they have been confounded together, no tongue nor pen can fully describe the mischiefs that have ensued." If you want the U.S. to be a Christian state, I want you to listen to that again. Anyways, now we get to 1776, when God looked down on the American colonists and said, "Thou shalt fuck up the British." And so it was, and it was good. Kidding, but Maryland, as it was becoming a state, restores the idea of freedom of religion into its constitution. Additionally, the Revolution makes the Church of England immensely unpopular, given that you're required to serve king and country as part of the Anglican Church. So, obviously, a lot of these churches either shuttered down or really hope the Americans lose. But given that we didn't lose, the Anglicans in the brand new US were shit out of luck. Luckily for them, by 1783, after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, we were mostly cool with England again. But because we had pretend to not like them, and also immediately saying, "I love you, Daddy," after biting his dick, kind of robs both actions of their impact. So in 1787, the Episcopal Church of the United States is founded, which is essentially the Church of England, but using the Scottish Canon Prayer Book, which, seeing as the Scots weren't a big fan of the English, didn't include all that suck off the king shit. And in 1786, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedoms is created and signed by Thomas Jefferson. Yes, that one, to ensure religious freedom. And the same year, the Anglican Church was de-established from the U.S., meaning the English Church no longer had its claws in our booty. And building off of that, in 1791, the First Amendment is added to the Constitution, reading as, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Now, this amendment covers a lot of things, but importantly here is that since 1791, America's official position on religion has been not our fucking problem, and the government has washed its hands of it. And as an example, in 1796, within the writing of the Treaty of Tripoli is the following: "As the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion, as it has in and of itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never entered into any war or active hostility against the Mohammedan nation, is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. Which is to say, as early as 1796, the U.S. government is saying, "Hey, we don't want to get fucked involved in your religion," which is the exact opposite of what some of you mouth breathers think we both did and should continue to do. Then in 1800, seemingly not getting the memo, the Second Great Awakening happens. This is an expansion of an awakening of Protestantism in the U.S. Now, this time, the idea was to spread the faith rather than revolutionize it. Despite this, in 1830, a new sect is created called Adventism. This form of Protestantism was created when the Baptist preacher William Miller placed the Second Coming of Christ to 1843, 13 years later. Now, this is fucking dumb, since you're going to have a doomsday prophecy put it after your death. Like how I think the world will end in October 2150. Am I wrong? If so, and you're listening to this at that time, go piss on my grave. Anyways, during the Second Great Awakening, in contradiction to this, Native American religious revival begins in 1805. Now, this starts in Indiana, led by Tenskwatawa. After he and many of his people survived a smallpox epidemic and a fucking witch hunt against Native Americans. Tenskwatawa led his followers to reject European and American influences, including stop speaking English and using rifles, and to instead fight back to reestablish their own faiths in their own lands. And rather than puttering out, given the Second Great Awakening happening, and also it was Native Americans doing anything, this movement was violently put down, with many of his followers and fellow leaders being killed by 1813, until he faded into obscurity himself by 1836. Meanwhile, in 1815, we have the establishment of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, created for black congregations by Richard Allen and his colleagues. Now, this was created because African Americans became disappointed and disillusioned with how fucking much white preachers were backpedaling their promises of freedom from slavery and racism, and finally decided, fuck it, I guess we'll just preach to ourselves. Which, more power to them. And in 1823, Mormonism begins with the visions and revelations of Joseph Smith, who writes what would later become the Book of Mormon. In the 1830s, this would spawn the Church of Christ, the official Church of Mormonism. Now, most people make fun of the Mormons and the Latter-day Saints, given that there's some, to say, issues with coming across like a cult, also doing some really fucking culty things, and also having a splinter group that does pedophilia, domestic abuse, and cult things. But at this time, this newly formed Abrahamic religion was persecuted pretty heavily. And no, not because people thought it was cringe, but because it openly allowed polygamy, or polyamory. And the difference there kind of depends on what you think of both polyamory and also how you think the Mormons use it. But this persecution led directly to the massacres of Mormons and also the rapid exodus to Utah, where in 1844, Joseph Smith was murdered by a posse of Christians, and his now scattered followers had a full-blown succession crisis, which caused the previously mentioned cult group, and the other not necessarily culty one that a lot of people still think is a cult. And then by the 1850s, we have the Third Great Awakening, lasting until the mid-early 20th century, right after World War I. This time, the focus was on intense religious activism and a worldwide missionary movement. This time, the focus was on intense religious activism and a worldwide missionary movement that all good Christians should go out and preach to these sweaty, filthy, sinful heathens that already have their own well-established religions, and also already know about Christianity. But, we aren't going to focus on that yet because we need to talk about the Civil War and whose side Sky Papa was on. And the answer is neither. And it's not because churches stayed out of it. Rather, the Methodists, Northern Baptists, and Congregationalists all supported the Union, either because they lived in the North or because they morally opposed the idea of slavery. And these groups, while not playing a massive role for the North in the military, performed support like medical aid and emotional support, or performed food and supply runs for the Union armies. Meanwhile, in the South, religion played a massive role in their armies. Not only did a lot of these armies have a chaplain in a lot of major roles and positions, and religious groups often followed them around to preach and perform things like tent revivals, but they were supported by the Southern Baptists, elite Presbyterians and Episcopals from both the North and the South, and other groups that had a vested interest in maintaining slavery or drank the flavor aid, believing that black people were children of Cain and deserved it. Yikes. And in 1866, African American Baptists also set up their own separate congregations, and Methodists and Baptists became exceptionally common in rural areas, while Catholics, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians became very common in the urban South. Also, after the Civil War, there was now a massive issue for organized religion. Because now, seeing as a lot of the most active components of the faith were more individualistic, the Civil War also breathed new life into missionary work. On top of all of this, beginning in the US and eventually spreading across the world, the gospel of wealth, the belief that God gifts his faithful with money, is traded with the social gospel, a new idea that the best way to perform God's work is to perform humanitarian acts. If that wasn't enough to make people ask questions about the Catholic Church, a new age of science was dawning, and as science began to question religious teachings, organized religions had to answer some tough questions about faith. So, how did they respond? Look, it kind of depends on the congregation, but to some, modern science was denied and ignored, or it was accepted in its entirety, or a mix of science and faith was adopted, or they decided, fuck it, you decide, which in turn created even more American individualism. And also, all of this caused a ton of changes. Most notably are the establishment of organizations such as the Theosophical Society in 1875, set to find divine truth, and the Christian Sciences, founded in Boston in 1879, which studies science with a Christian lens. Also during the period between 1869 to 1881, the missionary craze, and no, not the one I want, sends missions to North America, to Native American reservations, as the government decides to just let it happen without any input. Between the 1880s to 1920s, this missionary craze goes overseas as thousands upon thousands of missionaries travel across the oceans to evangelize groups from Europe to the southern tip of Africa, and all the way to China and Japan. And also during this era, organizations like the YMCA are founded, which assumedly is not yet a bastion of gay sex when it's founded. Now, all this changes in the 1930s, and while the Jehovah's Witnesses emerged in 1931, in the next year, the Layman's Report by Professor William Ernest Hawking says that evangelism isn't helping, and that the more Christian thing to do is, actually help people. Which, holy fuck, that's revolutionary. But the reason is because of the First World War, the Boxer Rebellion, and a ton of other shit that killed thousands of missionaries, ruining an entire generation of Christians. So rather than the move fast, eat ass ideals of American evangelicalism, the focus that is a lot safer, also a lot more impactful, is to do the good works in the name of God and let people come to you to be preached to. And unlike most other nations, the idea of religion gets fucked up by the Second World War. Especially the concept of a state-preferred religion. Therefore, things like prayer and Bible reading in schools were removed by 1962. Yes, you heard that. People complaining about prayer no longer being in school and no longer praying Jesus are remembering a time where if they went to public school, they straight up didn't experience unless they're very old. Fucking idiots. Anyways, this is also when the lemon test was developed to determine if a law um, affecting religion is allowed or not. And here's what it is. First, the legislature must have adopted the law with a neutral or non religious purpose. Second, the statute's principal or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. Third, the statute must not result in an excessive entanglement of government with religion. How about you do the lemon test with a couple of modern laws? Speaking of which, let's go over the modern day. Alright, so with that very dense history vaguely covered, what are we talking about with the current status of religion? Well, let's start off talking about the numbers before we really start talking about the problems I have with it. Well, the problems that exist about religion. Starting off worldwide, let's look at the top 10 religions of the world. In first place is Christianity, with a total of 2.4 billion members worldwide, or 30% of the world's population. In second is Islam, with 1.9 billion members, or 24% of the world's population. Third is Hinduism, with 1.2 billion members, with 15% of the world's population. And this is really it for the major religions. And I know that, yes, there are 7 more entries. Understand that after this, the numbers are very, very small in comparison to the rest of the big 3. So you can say Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, the big 3 religions. So fourth is Buddhism at 500 million. Folk religions, being small regional religions of specific clans, groups, and holdouts from very old faiths, has 400 million followers. Shintoism is at 100 million, and either below or above it, with between 12 to 173 million, is Taoism. And that mostly depends on if you view Taoism as a religion or a philosophy of life. Voodoo has 60 million people in 8th place, Sikhism at 30 million, and finally Judaism at 14.5 million practitioners, which is very, very small. But also, out of the top 10, 4 of them, with a total of 54.93% of all humans, follow an Abrahamic religion. But a very significant number also follows a form of Eastern religion. And with that, let's look at the US real quick. But keep in mind that it's hard to find actual good numbers for this, given that for whatever reason in the US, we want to list either 30 different fucking kinds of Jesus is a cool dude, so we should do what he says religions, or just listing all Abrahamic religions as one faith. So I'm using some old 2004 numbers. And I know that's gross, but just stick with me. At number 1 is Christianity, with 234.32 million followers. Second is Judaism at 4.6 million followers. Third is Islam at 2.6 million. And Buddhism is tied with them, but they're at 4th with another 2.6. And finally, Hinduism at 1.66 million. Now, the point of listing these, besides numbers being pretty fucking cool, is because when we talk about the issues, it's particularly important to understand that we aren't talking about a minority here. Most people have a religion of some kind, and most of them are an Abrahamic one, which is very important because this is the first issue we should discuss. Now, since the 3 major Abrahamic religions were all found under duress, these religions have a built-in persecution in their teachings, meaning that even when they are a majority, these religions will view any kind of pushing against them or corralling of their power as a persecution. What's my basis for this? Well, besides seeing the fucking news, look at their origins. Judaism was forged in the crucible of the Middle East, surrounded by other religions, and if you've read the Tanakh, have been enslaved and conquered for millennia by these others, meaning that they've had to, by and large, become a very, very heavily warrior focused and dedicated religion. And hence the intense discipline and many mentions in the Tanakh about Jewish warriors. Christianity was founded being persecuted by conservative Judaism and theo-fascist Romans. And even once Rome adopted their religion, it was right in time for the hordes of pagans out for revenge against Rome to sweep through and fuck their shit up. And Islam emerged during a period of, once again, upheaval in the Middle East and North Africa, and they faced massive conflict with pagans, Christians, and other religions that almost destroyed it from the beginning. In addition, they also faced a lot of conflict against people that weren't fighting them on the basis of religion. And why is all this is important? And why is all this important? Well, because in America, Abrahamic religions are exceptionally powerful, and given that each of them see themselves as needing to fight against their enemy at all times, anything that goes against their beliefs gets the war horns blaring. And this makes the second issue even worse. Given the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free expression thereof, there's a lot of debate about what that means. Some people view it that the government should be the referee between religions, keeping them all in control and stopping them from getting too wild and wacky. Others see this as meaning that the government should be entirely atheist and not give a single fuck about religion, and should also never bend to religious groups. And others still think that this means that the government needs to be a crusader for faith, defending it and respecting it like a tier 3 sub of a female streamer hoping for some cast-off coochie. And while this is all good at the Thanksgiving table because no one's opinions will change and everyone hates everyone anyways, and the only reason why we do this is because American culture doesn't value chosen family nearly as much as it should, it's entirely different when a bus full of politicians hold these opinions and are actively fighting each other about it right now. Which means that the side that wins says that actually America is a Christian nation and should tier 3 sub to Muscle Mommy God and motherfucking waffle stomp every other religion. We now have Nazis too. God makes me goo spew. And because of this debate and constant struggle, the US is really inconsistent in how it rules on religious issues, which causes all the other issues we're talking about. Firstly, there's a massive gulf in understanding of religions and faith, which, while you might assume only hurts my brain because I'm a stupid little nerd that wants to force everyone to learn useless shit like I have, actually does a lot more harm than that. For example, did you know before this that Islam actually preaches not only peace but also cooperation and unity with other Abrahamic religions? And did you know that Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism all believe in the importance of personal cultivation and self-care and aren't all about meditating and being a chill dude? And while sure, the second one might just cause people to be pleasantly surprised or confused that the frail old Taoist is suddenly hand walking on the fucking walls, the first can be a lot more dangerous. Because in the US, if someone decides that all of Islam is evil and wants to burn down churches, they might start trying to attack Muslims and mosques. But of course, the US is mostly silent about this kind of stuff because it's trying to stay neutral and not teach people about religion. Also, it benefits from this because, yikes. But then you get to the deeply seated Judeo-Christian influences on American law, which leans heavily on the idea that all of us are supposed to be some combination of the two. It's not like we can untangle them because ultimately, somehow our legal code assumes that everyone is terrified of an eternity in hell for making a promise to God and then breaking that promise. Which is what being sworn in court is. Because ultimately, if you're a convincing enough liar, lying about something that no one else could possibly know about, how can the punishment of perjury be effective against you unless you believe that Sky Daddy is watching you and you literally just promised him you weren't going to lie? So if we untangle this concept, suddenly the legal system doesn't have a convenient thing to point to and say, I have the power of God and anime on my side to dissuade people who believe in the power of God and or anime. And on top of this, a lot of laws, especially ones being moved through our legislators right now, seem determined that America is a Judeo Christian haven. Things like religious institutions being tax free, despite the presence of megachurches and clear cults like Scientology, and fucking sue me Scientologists, you'll only give me more clout, deserved deserving to be fucking taxed. And obviously, this also includes anti-LGBTQI plus laws that really only have any kind of ground to stand on if you're really dumb or have religious conniptions about the idea that queers exist. And the same can be said about abortion laws. And because the US is supposed to stay neutral in religion, but also defend it, but also destroy it, there's no fucking response to all these happening, and they're treated seriously, and people trying to prevent laws from being introduced on the basis of religion get smacked with the First Amendment like a mushroom stamped to the forehead. And look, I know all of this sounds like in some way doomsday is upon us, but don't worry. So, yes, this is fucking awful. Remember America's history. Much as these fucks want America to be a Christian nation state, it's been continuously less and less religious. Thankfully, this is a fucking swan song. One that we should be fighting, but it's a fucking swan song. Okay, but let's get less angry and go to the politics and opinions. And we're gonna start first with defining some religious groups. And no, not by their religion, but by their behavior around it. The first group are the highly religious, making up roughly 39% of all Americans. And this group is divided into three subgroups. The Sunday stalwarts, representing 17% of Americans, are the people who are not only very traditional, but are actually highly involved in their religion and actively perform the rituals and are active in the community. The God and Country believers, making up 12% of the population, are the people who are extremely and unreasonably conservative and use their religion to justify it. The final of this kind is called the diversely devout, or diversely religious as I'll call it later, being 11% of Americans, are traditionally religious but are also believers in other spiritual things like psychics and tarot. I almost said psychers. The second group is the somewhat religious, being 32% of Americans. This is divided into two groups. The first being relaxed religious, with 17% of Americans whose faith is important to them, but don't believe that believing in God is necessary. The others, at 15%, are the spiritually awake, who have non-traditional beliefs and often subscribe to New Agey bullshit. I'm kidding, I like New Agey bullshit. And finally are the two kinds of non-religious, representing 29% of Americans. The first are religious resistors, making up 12% of Americans, are people who think that religion does more harm than good. And the second are called solidly secular, who are 17% of Americans and hold no religious or spiritual beliefs at all, or none that are significant. Which means that 17% of Americans are fedora tipping Redditors. But of this, let's quickly go over their spiritual identity, because there's some weird stuff here. So 96% of the Sunday stalwart would say that they're spiritual, and 90% are religious. 91% of the God and Country motherfuckers are spiritual, while 85% are religious. 86% of the diversely devout are spiritual, while 85% are religious. 64% of the relaxed religious are spiritual, and 51% are religious. While 78% of the spiritually awake are spiritual, while 43% are religious, and of the final group, 68% of the religious resistors are spiritual, and 22% of the solidly secular are spiritual. But 3% of the non-religious are actually religious. So, I'm telling you that just to keep a little bit of a grain of salt about this. But these represent most general ideas around faith in America. But what do they actually believe? How do they behave? Well, let's use the ideas of scripture reading, religious service attendance, and their general religious engagement. Now, as far as reading religious scripture goes, the highly religious actually don't seem to do it very much on average. Only 73% of Sunday stalwarts, 33% of God and Country, and 27% of diversely devout people read their book of choice. making making using it as an argument even more ironic from any of them. Now, of the somewhat religious, 11% of the relaxed religious read scripture, and 9% of the spiritually awake. And for the weird one, less than 1% of the religious resistors read scripture, but 3% of solidly secular people do. Which might seem fucking ridiculous, but keep in mind that the two kinds of people who know their Bible the best are people that actually study it as the true word of God and follow its teachings, and people who want to throw Bible verses as a fucking sick burn in an argument against the God and country motherfucker. Okay, and for the number of people who attend services, 82% of Sunday stalwarts, 27% of God and country idiots, and 12% of the diversely religious attend services. Which, this is a pattern you're going to see across the highly religious. The God and country and diversely religious don't participate much, while the Sunday stalwarts actually put their money where their mouth is. The relaxed religious attend 17% of the time, and the spiritually awake attend 8% of the time, while the non-religious attend 2% of the time, assumedly being dragged there by relatives. And for the religious engagement, beyond attendance, all Sunday stalwarts participate in some kind of religious group. Again, putting their money where their mouth is, but only 84% pray daily. For the God and country folk, 72% pray daily, but less than 1% even participate in religious groups. I'm like forcing ideals on others, but not actually following them. Okay, and the diversely devout, 58% pray daily, and 9% participate in religious groups. For the somewhat religious, the relaxed religious are part of religious groups 2% of the time, and 39% pray daily, while the spiritually awake are part of religious groups 4% of the time, and 44% pray daily. Now, for the fucking weirdos, 12% of religious resistors pray daily, while 2% of them are amongst you, you very, very Christian folk. And 2% of the solidly secular pray daily, and 3% of them are infiltrating your religion. Watch out. And finally, since the specific beliefs aren't especially important, let's see what these groups believe the impact of religion is. Now, religion does more good than harm, according to 86% of Sunday stalwarts, 77% of God and country, 70% of diversely devout, 58% of the relaxed religious, 53% of the spiritually awake, 15% of the religious resistors, and finally 29% of the solidly secular. Which is weird that any percentage of the people that think that religion is bad for society think it's actually good. But, hey, I'm not going to judge them much. Okay, for religion helping family, 76% of Sunday stalwarts, 54% God and country, 44% of diversely devout, 21% of the relaxed religious, 17% of the spiritually awake, 3% of the religious resistors, and finally 1% of the solidly secular. And so what do we get from all of these data points? Well, ultimately, what we get is that people in the US are hypocrites, which is not surprising. But how does politics ruin all of this? Well, not really. Because on the conservative end, the US is and should be a Christian nation, or a Judeo-Christian nation, if you want to get a little close to blasphemous, and a little close to those fucking liberals. And meanwhile, on the left, the idea is that the US should be run like it's controlled by a bunch of atheists, but that if the people want to believe in something, it's not Daddy Sam's business what wacky shit you're getting up to as long as no one's getting hurt. And actually, this kind of just straight up addresses the issues we're talking about earlier. Because on the right, the idea is that all of those issues we talked about aren't bugs, they're features. Like Skyrim. Anti-abortion laws, gay people being bad, God and schools in the Constitution, and tax-free churches are how society is supposed to work. Which is gross. For the left, however, all of these issues can be traced back to the fact that we're too big of pussies to actually strip religion of their power in the United States. Everything that can't be backed up with a non-religious reason doesn't belong in the government, they say, including anti-abortion laws, untaxable churches and putting God everywhere. And, I gotta say, I kind of agree with them on that. But to tell you more about what I think, let's just go over to the soapbox. Okay, so here at the end, where am I with religion? I'm mostly meh, but like a respectful meh, not a dismissive one. Because here's the deal. I think that religion, like your hobbies, should be something that you use to give your life meaning and making it feel worth living when contrasted against the cruel, hard, dark reality we're surrounded by constantly. But I mean, would you want to force everyone into your hobby or place the values of your hobby into an enshrined part of the government system? No? See, that's how I feel about religion. I find the people that follow their religion and try their best to live by its teachings, they're just straight up cool with people doing their own thing to be really respectable and cool. Because at the core, they're making a choice to live that way that gives them meaning, and fucking more power to them. We need more things in our lives that give us meaning. But it's the shitbags that get me. It's the people who use faith as a bludgeon to make people do what they want because they're too stupid to formulate why they want it in the first place. If even they do want it, or they're just flanderizing their own religion. Especially the people that don't follow the rules but still claim it. And it fills me with the same baby rage I get when people claim being a nerd and don't do a single goddamn dirty thing. And the worse I see it, because I'm an American, is with Christians. Look, sorry if you're part of the group of Christianity that I like, but you should know more than I do that there's way too many people out there who have never even read the fucking Bible claiming to be Christians because they want to have a reason to hate queers and minorities and think Jeezy Boy is the best way to do it, despite the fact everything Jesus Christ has ever said. And look, while I've made fun of religion, most of this episode, don't get it twisted. I'm not a fedora tipping Redditor. I'm a spiritualist with my own faith, one that I don't practice nearly as much as I wish I could. That's also a good reason to donate to me. But I'm still a spiritualist, and in that way, yeah, I'm religious. But I keep poking at religion not because I think it's evil, because if you don't poke at it, then you begin to take it too seriously. And every single little prod from life turns you into a Chernobyl of gamer words. And obviously, I also won't judge someone for not being religious. I make fun of you too, but obviously when you take a step back, religion can be and does get silly. And hey, there's some real negatives to it too. And if y'all are keeping the world turning by not letting the rest of us nutcases run the show unopposed. But anyways, let's go home. And there you are. Episode 10 done. And remember, I'm going to take a bit of a posting break out of this episode, so don't panic if you don't see me for a while. And depending on how you feel about the quality of these episodes lately, you might be happy that I'm taking a bit of a break. But, as always, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, the exact line of scripture to damn me to hell for eternity, an invitation to attend church I will politely ignore, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That's WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. Remember to check out my other podcast, WAYTAT Nerd, where I do basically the same thing, but with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc., where I hope you'll like the topics just as much as this one. Also, remember to follow me on Twitter at WAYTATPods for more episode announcements, and maybe some other stuff. I'm starting to try to figure out how to use Twitter. But anyways, have a good night. Don't murder. Have fun. And remember, slip an extra dollar bill on that tray for Jeezy Boy. This has been Why Are You Talking About This? And I've been your host, William. Good night.